So good evening, all the doctors who have joined the webinar. First of all, I would like to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for such an overwhelming response for this webinar series. Warm regards and greetings from Genesis IVF. Today I have a case scenario discussion. I actually have 6 interesting clinical case scenarios on recurrent pregnancy loss. We actually have to be really fast to finish all 6 cases within the stipulated time of 1 hour 15 minutes. So let's get started. So these are my simple learning objectives. We will go through the common causes of RPL, but our main focus is on the causes of RPL which are often being overlooked. We will look into the standard line of management which all of us are aware of. We will look into the newer management protocols and the supportive evidence for the same. Now, before stepping into case number 1, a very short introduction about this condition, recurrent pregnancy loss. Whenever there are 3 or more consecutive pregnancy losses, we call it RPL. But we really don't have to wait for 3 consecutive pregnancy losses to initiate our investigation or to initiate our management. After 2 consecutive pregnancy loss, we need to start our evaluation. Please note this terminology, consecutive pregnancy loss. 2 sporadic miscarriages is relatively a benign terminology and they can be effectively handled. Consecutive pregnancy loss, then that is a significant condition and it definitely demands our attention. As we all know, the 4 most common causes for RPL are immunological, structural uterine cavity abnormalities, endocrine dysfunction, and chromosomal abnormalities. With this short intro, we'll get started with the case scenario discussion. Now, we have Mrs. Rameja, 39-year-old female, married since 15 years. She had undergone 4 cycles of IVF before. She had undergone 4 cycles of IVF before and 2 cycles of IVF failed, but she was twice pregnant with IVF before. But she had 2 miscarriages, one at 8th week and the second miscarriage was around 14th week. 13 years back, she had once conceived naturally and at 7th month, she had an intrauterine death. It was an unexplained IUD. So totally, she had 3 pregnancy losses, one in the first trimester, second in the early second trimester, and one in the late, like around 28 to 29 weeks of gestation. Now she came to us for the 5th cycle of IVF. Owing to her low AMH, we actually suggested egg donation for her. But being a Muslim patient, she was very insistent with her own eggs and we did an IVF on her. Luckily, she got pregnant the very first cycle. She actually gave us around 4 oocytes, 2 were mature and we did ICSI. She had 2 grade 1 blasts. We transferred. She actually had a frozen embryo transfer and she conceived. Now, the point to be noted here, achieving a pregnancy in her was not a great deal because already before she had even conceived naturally. Now, giving her a term live birth is the biggest challenge. Now, what are all the investigations you think should have been done prior to her embryo transfer? We actually did a set of investigations on her, but whatever you feel are the best panel of investigations to be done, please type it and send it across. And what do you think is the most likely case for RPL in this patient? Now, this is a very classical case presentation. And whatever you feel is the best line of management, please share it with us. I'll go ahead with the discussion. Now, we did her hormone profile before her IVF stimulation. It was correspondingly normal for her age. We did an AMH, it was around 1.1. Though 1.1 is a low AMH, her age is 39 years. And the most important point is that she had undergone 4 cycles of IVF stimulation before. So for her clinical condition, I think it is reasonably a good value, 1.1. We did a 3D USG, her uterine cavity was found to be normal. To be on a safer side, we did a high vaginal swab culture also, it showed normal flora. And when we looked into her antibody profile, she tested strongly positive for lupus anticoagulant. An anti-cardiolipin antibody was also positive. Her anti-nuclear antibody was mildly positive and anti-thyroid antibody, the thyroid peroxidase antibody, TPO antibody was also positive. So it's very clear, it's a case of immunological cause for RPL. She is an APLA patient along with thyroid autoimmunity. Now, what do I mean by strongly positive and mildly positive is that it's just based on the titration ratio, nothing significant. Now let's look into the line of management. We actually did embryo transfer for her 3 months after her oocyte pickup, and this 3 month was taken for her system preparation and for pre-embryo transfer preparation to prevent recurrent miscarriages. Now we started her on HCQS 200 milligram twice a day, 2 months prior to her embryo transfer. So it's totally 400 milligram a day. Now, HCQS is actually a very good immunomodulatory drug, and it's got a very strong anti-inflammatory effect. It works really good in women who test positive for antibodies. I have never been concerned about the safety issues of HCQS ever before, but recently after this COVID pandemic, there is a very big hangama regarding the safety concerns of HCQS, because there are lots of WhatsApp messages stating that it causes unexplained cardiac death in young patients. So I spoke to one of my friends. He's a rheumatologist in UK. He works for the Warwick University. He very clearly stated that HCQS is a safe drug. Definitely it's a safe drug, provided you need to start it with an absolute indication. We cannot give it as a blanket therapy for all. You need an absolute indication to put the patient on HCQS. Either the women should test positive for some antibody, or the women might be testing negative for antibody, but the clinical history is representative of an immunological cause. It can be used both in infertile couples as well as in women with recurrent pregnancy loss. Now, the next drug is Visalone. It was started 10 milligram, and it was started just 3 weeks prior to her embryo transfer. Now, the purpose of adding prednisolone is to bring down the uterine natural killer cell count. Now, this terminology of natural killer cells is something that we have come across during our pathology days. Now, these natural killer cells are strongly immunogenic cells. They are inflammatory cells. So when the level of uterine natural killer cells are high, they either cause embryo rejection. So the women will present with recurrent IVF failures, or the women can also present with recurrent miscarriages. So to bring down the level of uterine natural killer cells, now Visalone was started 3 weeks prior. The third drug is vitamin D. 60,000 units was initiated. Like, it was given once a week for 8 weeks, but the ideal therapy is to give once a week for 12 weeks. As we all know, vitamin D also has got a very strong immunomodulatory and anti-inflammatory effect. Generally, a woman with an immunological cause for RPL, they have all kinds of inflammatory cells at a very high level in the body. This by itself is one of the major reasons for their pregnancy loss. So we need to bring them down. The purpose of adding Visalone and the purpose of adding vitamin D are the same. Now, vitamin D receptors have also been isolated in the decidua as well as in the cytotrophoblast, which very clearly states that vitamin D in adequate level is needed for proper embryo implantation, and similarly, it is needed for good embryogenesis and to prevent obstetric mishaps. Now, this patient was given folic acid and vitamin B12 for 3 months prior to her embryo transfer. This generally, this is a blanket therapy which you can give it for everybody, because it brings down the serum homocysteine level, and in those women with elevated serum homocysteine are most likely to suffer from obstetric mishaps. So this can be initiated prior to their conception. Now, prior to her embryo transfer, we started the patient on low dose aspirin. It was 75 milligram bedtime, 1 month it was given. Now, the rationale behind the use of aspirin is to bring down the inflammatory cytokines. We are concerned about two important inflammatory cytokines. One is prostacyclin and the other one is thromboxane. Both are absolutely deleterious for the early embryonic growth. So now ecosprin is documented to bring down the level of these inflammatory cytokines, and that's the reason why we have added it 1 month prior to her embryo transfer. From the day of embryo transfer, we made low dose aspirin 150 milligrams. So it was doubled. Prior to her embryo transfer, it was 75 milligram, but after her embryo transfer, it was made 150 milligram HS. Now we have added enoxaparin from the day of embryo transfer. Now the purpose of adding enoxaparin is to give a very good antithrombotic effect and to inhibit the complement mediated action. As we all know, if a woman has an immunological cause for RPL, lot of thrombotic events happen at the level of placental vasculature. The drug which can effectively counteract all these thrombotic changes and the drug which can prevent the obstetric mishap is enoxaparin. So that's the rationale behind the addition of enoxaparin, but we don't have to add it prior to their conception. And because this woman has tested strongly positive for 2 to 3 antibodies, we actually gave her immunoglobulin as well to bring down the severity and the effect of antibodies. We gave her IM immunoglobulin. We have a lot of pharmacological preparations available. I think it comes in the name of Barglobe. You can use it even for patients who conceive naturally. Now, all the drugs I've mentioned here, HCQS, Visalone, vitamin D, folic acid, low-dose aspirin, enoxaparin, all these drugs can be used even in those women who are planning to conceive naturally. This is not a reserved set of drug for patients undergoing IVF. Just because this woman was 39-year-old and she had the complaint of secondary infertility as well, she had to step into IVF. Otherwise, all these drugs can be used prior to natural conception in all your patients who are planning to conceive naturally. The only thing is that they need to have at least 3 months gap for all these medicines to act, minimum of 2 months gap. Now, this Visalone was continued only till the fetal heartbeat appeared. After the fetal heartbeat appeared, we need to gradually taper down the dose and stop it. Maybe around 7 to 8 weeks of gestation, we need to stop the prednisolone drug. Actually, after embryo transfer, that is after your pregnancy confirmation, you can make Visalone 10 milligram twice a day. Prior to her conception, it was once a day 10 milligram. Now, after conception, it's totally 20 milligram a day. But after the appearance of heartbeat, you need to step down the dose. Now, as usual, regular progesterone supplementation was continued till she completed her first trimester. Now, this patient was given a cervical stitch at 16 weeks because she had a short cervix. Her length was around 2.3 centimeter. And from 16th week onwards, I initiated her on L-arginine sachet, which is 5 grams a day. Kindly note the dosage. The common formulations that we have are L-arginine sachets, which are 3 grams a day. That is only prophylactic. But for these kind of women who test positive for all kinds of antibodies or even one antibody, the APLA positive women are more likely to suffer from severe uteroplacental insufficiency. So 3 grams will not be adequate. You need to give them 5 grams sachet and it has to be added as early as possible. And once in 3 weeks, IM immunoglobulin was continued till 28 weeks. There is actually no need to continue it beyond 12 weeks, but just because this patient had an history of unexplained IUD at 28th week, we had to continue IM immunoglobulin till 28th week because there is no other drug in the market which can control the antibodies as good as an immunoglobulin. Now, 30 weeks, we did a scan and we identified oligohydramnios and she had asymmetrical IUGR as expected. She developed preeclampsia. We actually started her on labetalol. It was not controlled. We put her on nifedipine, Calcigard, and we continued both the drugs. The patient was admitted. Now the patient was admitted because her changes have already started. So we started doing a Doppler study every 3rd day, and this low-dose aspirin was continued till 32nd week, and enoxaparin 40 milligrams subcutaneous was also continued till 32nd week. We administered her steroids around 32 weeks. Now, because this patient was an abruption, we felt it quite comfortable or easy enough to handle her because at 33rd week, she presented with acute abdomen. She had bleeding per vaginum. She developed abruption. We had to do an emergency section on her. It was a 1.8 kg baby, though it was an IUGR baby was doing really well. Baby just needed NICU care for 2 days. She recently delivered, so I just had the picture of this baby. This is actually a very naughty baby, gave us so much of trouble, but ultimately it happened. Nothing extra, it's all the immunosuppressant therapy which helped us to tide over the critical phase. whatever kinds of drug we have initiated on this patient, they are relatively safe enough. We don't have to worry about any kind of teratogenic effects. And the next point to be noted is that whatever drugs that we use, it will not prevent 100% of changes due to this APLA or due to SLE or due to thyroid autoimmunity. What we can do is we can delay the onset of these changes. Meanwhile, the baby will have viability and we can deliver the baby. So it is not possible for us to prevent obstetric mishap by 100%, but at least we can delay the onset of these obstetric mishaps so that we have a viable baby. Nowadays, 28 plus is a very safe period to deliver the babies because we've got adequate NICU care. Now, the take-home points is that vitamin D supplementation really makes good sense because it's got a strong immunomodulatory and anti-inflammatory effect. And you don't need a reason actually to supplement vitamin D. Any case with RTL, you can blindly put them on vitamin D, but make sure it's only for 8 to 12 weeks, not beyond that. Now, Visalone brings down the uterine natural killer cells. Ecosprin brings down the level of all inflammatory cytokines, which predominantly contributes to miscarriages as well as early onset severe preeclampsia. And heparin has got a very strong anti-thrombotic effect. It also inhibits the complement mediated activation. Then we have HCQS, which is a strong immunomodulatory drug with strong anti-inflammatory effect. Now let's step into case number 2. Mrs. Shruti, 25-year-old female, married since 3 years. She conceived naturally once, but she miscarried at 17 weeks. It was documented to be cervical incompetence. We do not have any record. There was one paper stating that she miscarried because of cervical incompetence. Cervical length and all was not mentioned. She had undergone IUI in an outside hospital in Gobi. She conceived. Now, this particular doctor referred her to me only for the purpose of cervical encirclage. Now, she came to me, we did the cervical length assessment. It was 3.5 centimeter, reasonably okay. But still, we planned for a cervical stitch on her because there was a previous history of cervical incompetence. So I think stitch was planned like 4 or 5 days later. Because the patient was on Ecosprin. So I wanted her to stop the drug. So I asked her to come back after 4 or 5 days for cervical stitch. Now, just 2 days prior to the planned cervical stitch, she presented with draining and she expelled the baby in the same hospital where she underwent IUI. Now, I was literally upset. The doctor who referred this patient to me was also equally upset. We both were very sure that we missed out something on this patient. One thing I was relatively confident was that this particular miscarriage is not because of cervical incompetence. Because when I did the cervical length assessment, I did a transvaginal scan only. The cervix length was good enough. I'm not just talking about the cervical length. The cervico-uterine angle was quite satisfactory. The other thing was that the internal os was closed. There was no dilatation. There was no coning of bag of membrane. The architecture looked so satisfactory. I could not believe that within a span of 46 to 48 hours that she had expelled the baby. Now, the same patient, she came back to me with all her previous case records. Now, what do you all think the likely diagnosis would be? Is it still cervical incompetence, or do you think there could be something else which had been missed out? Or what additional tests do you think should be done now? What could have been done in the earlier pregnancy to prevent this miscarriage? Now, this patient, she actually came back with all her previous records. I went through her case record. I was just talking to the patient. Incidentally, she told me, every time I develop white discharge, profuse or copious white discharge, within a span of 7 to 10 days, I miscarry the baby. That's what she told me. Then I asked her, did you tell this to your doctor? She said, no. Last time also I had the same problem, doctor. My body, it gets really heated up in summer season. I had chicken and all, they will have their own explanation. All this will happen. So it is because of that only, I didn't take it to be really significant. So I haven't mentioned it. So I thought, okay, a high vaginal swab should be done on this patient. I did a high vaginal swab, the same consultation. The result came out to be bacterial vaginosis with a very heavy growth of candidiasis. The heavy growth of candidiasis was so alarming that the microbiologist, before sending the culture report to my hospital, he called me on phone. He said it was too heavy. Definitely it needs management. Then I thought, okay, fine, the diagnosis, the reason for her miscarriage this time is definitely not incompetence. It's because of bacterial vaginosis and it's a chronic recurrent candidiasis. Because she always had this complaint, but she never considered it to be significant and she had never mentioned this earlier. She had been trying some sort of home remedies. So now we treated her with a regular line of management. We gave her this vaginal pessary for 3 days, which is clindamycin along with clotrimazole for 3 days. And I gave her oral itraconazole as well for 3 days. We repeated the swab, high vaginal swab, after 15 days of this therapy. Still, it showed yeast cells in heavy growth. I spoke to the microbiologist. He said the picture of bacterial vaginosis has changed, but not even 10% there is reduction in growth of these hyphae cells and yeast cells. So I thought this dose of antifungal was not effective. I gave her vaginal fenticonazole this time. Usually all of us use clotrimazole. It's quite safe. It's easily tolerated. Now this fenticonazole is a very recent group and very efficient group of azole drug. It works really good. Multiple doses are not needed. A single stat dose is sufficient. But what I did on this patient, I gave a stat dose and after 3 days I repeated the dose. Then I gave her oral antifungals also. I will share the regimen shortly. I started the patient on probiotics also because this is not a problem which is of acute onset. It's a very chronic onset problem. So I started her on probiotics twice a day. Then we repeated the high vaginal swab after 20 days of this therapy. Only then she showed normal flora growth. Now we did IUI again on this patient. She conceived. To be on a safer side, we gave her a cervical stitch around 15 weeks, and now she's running her 27th week of gestation. I just wanted to put across this case because not all early second trimester miscarriages are because of cervical incompetence. Now, this vaginal infection is also a cause for RPL, which is often overlooked. We really do not evaluate high vaginal swab for all patients. It is definitely not needed to be evaluated in all patients, but if the history is indicative, definitely high vaginal swab is a very inexpensive and a very efficient tool. It gives us a lot of information of what kind of therapy has to be initiated. If the patient tells you white discharge and you initiate her on clindamycin or clotrimazole, sometimes it doesn't get corrected. So it's better we always confirm with a high vaginal swab, and this culture will tell you exactly what drug needs to be given. Now, oral itraconazole was actually given 200 milligram OD for 3 days, similarly for 3 cycles, which means for 3 months. Day 1 to 3. This month she'll be given 200 milligram of itraconazole. Next menstrual cycle, 3 days, 200 milligram, 3 days. The third menstrual cycle also, she was given 200 milligram OD for 3 days. That's how we corrected her vaginal flora. And then for bacterial vaginosis, not always vaginal clindamycin is adequate. For some people it is adequate, but for some people it is not adequate. So at that point, we need to start them on oral clindamycin 300 milligram BD for 5 days and oral metronidazole 500 milligram BD for 5 days. Both these drugs are actually FDA category B drugs, so you can use it even during your pregnancy. But itraconazole is actually a category C drug. Only if the benefits outweigh risk, you need to use it on the patient. Otherwise, antifungal oral therapy is not recommended in pregnancy. Now, there is definitely a role for probiotics. I do not mean to say that probiotic is a miracle drug to be used, but it definitely has a role in clinical improvement. It will definitely not harm your patient. It can either do something good or it will be neutral. It will not harm the patient. There is a significant role to be played by probiotics, especially in patients who present with recurrent candidiasis or recurrent BV. So that's with case number 2. That was relatively a lighter case to handle. The only problem was that we missed the diagnosis. It was totally clueless. Until we spoke to the patient, we were totally clueless of what was going wrong with the patient. And now we'll step on to case number 3. We had this patient, Mrs. Maitri, 29-year-old, married since 5 years. She was in the overweight category. Her BMI was 29. She had a non-consanguineous marriage. and her menstrual cycle was something like 1 to 2 days, and it was once in 35 to 45 days. Now she was married to Mr. Nelson, 36-year-old male. He had normal semen analysis. Now this patient had 3 consecutive miscarriages. Once was normal conception immediately after marriage. Then the other 2 miscarriages were with IUI conception. She actually underwent only 2 cycles of IUI. Both the cycles she conceived, but she miscarried. Once at 7th week, once at 9th week, and the third miscarriage was at 8th week. Now, what do you think is the most likely cause? Actually, she had all 3 miscarriages in her first trimester only. So what do you think is the most likely cause? And what do you think are the ideal array of investigations to be carried out on this patient? And what do you think is the most successful subsequent line of management? Now, because she had all 3 miscarriages in the first trimester, even we thought it could be a chromosomal abnormality, and we started our evaluation. First, we did her hormonal profile because her cycles were a little erratic. It was not correlating with her age. We were surprised to see her day 2 FSH to be 10. Now, day 2 FSH for a woman less than 30 years should definitely be less than or equal to 7. Now, FSH 10 very clearly shows that she's got a low ovarian reserve. Her ovarian reserve is dropping down drastically. TSH was somewhere around 4.5. Outside pregnancy, this is maybe we can take it as a normal value, but in pregnancy, I think it has to be less than or equal to 2.5. So we started her on levothyroxine supplementation, very minimal dose we started. Her prolactin was okay, 21 nanogram per ml. Her AMH was 1.2. It was correlating with her FSH value. So she is definitely a woman with low ovarian reserve. Now her transvaginal ultrasound is normal, except that she had reduced antral follicle count for her age. We repeated the semen analysis and it was found to be normal again. Now, products of conception, karyotyping, already she had done twice before with Perkin-Elmer. No significant aneuploidy was detected, and parental karyotyping was also normal. So now, what do you think is the likely diagnosis? One point I wanted to highlight here. Now, this chromosomal abnormality is basically a paper diagnosis for RPL. Less than 2% of couples with RPL will actually have some sort of abnormalities in their karyotyping result. So we have to be really vigilant in interpreting these results. The most common abnormality that we see is balanced reciprocal translocation and Robertsonian translocation. Very, very rarely we find some sex chromosomal abnormality. Most of the time the result turns out to be normal. We really cannot plan our subsequent management just based on the karyotyping results. So we thought, okay, there might be some microscopic deletion which was missed out on the karyotyping result. So it could be either chromosomal, or we thought her poor egg quality because of low ovarian reserve was the reason for her consecutive first trimester miscarriages. Then we decided to do IVF on her. She actually came for a next cycle of IUI, but we explained her what was going wrong. We planned to do a PGD on her embryos. For the purpose of PGD, she had to get enrolled for IVF. So before IVF, we gave her this investigation, sperm DFI, DNA fragmentation index. Alarmingly, the result came out to be very, very high. It was 58%. Normally, it is expected to be less than 30%. But for this patient, it was 58%. It means 58% of her husband's sperms were fragmented and absolutely unhealthy. So now this is a case of male factor for RPL. Till this investigation, we were thinking only about the women. But this is a classic case of male factor for RPL, and the male culprit over here are the fragmented sperms. The other thing could have contributed. She also had a low ovarian reserve. It could have contributed, but still the main culprit over here are the fragmented sperms. So because she had a very high value of DNA fragmentation index, we did not do ICSI on her because it is expected to give very low results and the percentage of euploid embryos would be less. We did something called IMSI. where morphologically normal sperms would first be sorted out, prepared, and then it would be injected into the egg. We also did pre-implantation genetic diagnosis on day 5 blastocyst. 4 embryos turned out to be euploid. We transferred 2. Initially, she had twin conception, but later then there was a vanishing twin. And finally, we had a single baby boy delivered at term, and it was healthy. So the main take-home point with this classical case is that sperm analysis or the semen analysis, if it turns out to be normal, it just tells us that the sperms are quantitatively good enough. So it doesn't speak to us anything about the quality of the sperms. The only test which can talk to us about the quality of the sperms is sperm DNA fragmentation index. Whenever the oocytes are healthy and whenever an abnormal or a fragmented sperm gets into it, it can cause DNA changes in the resulting embryo. Now, these DNA changes in the resulting embryo, it will get implanted, but there are DNA errors occurring at every level of embryogenesis. Beyond a certain point, this embryo is not able to progress. That's the reason why they present with recurrent first trimester miscarriages. So this is quite an important investigation. I do not mean to say that everybody should undergo sperm DNA fragmentation index. It is actually a very costly test to be done. Need not be done on everybody, but still this test should be there at the back of our mind. Normal semen analysis does not always mean that sperms are absolutely normal. So we have to consider male factor as well if we are evaluating RPL. So now, so that was a case of male factor for RPL. We will step into case number 4. Mrs. Sarada, 27-year-old female, married since 3 years. She had 2 consecutive miscarriages. One was at 9th week of gestation. The second was at 14th week of gestation. All 2 were natural conceptions. No evaluation for RPL was done. No karyotyping was done. She's actually a staff nurse who's working under an obstetrician. So she is quite clear with what kind of treatment she was going through. Now she presented in her 3rd pregnancy when she was 11 weeks pregnant to us. She was already on progesterone support, and we just did a high vaginal swab on her because she complained white discharge, but normal flora was grown. The thing is, white discharge in pregnancy is not always pathological. It could even be physiological, but the only problem is that we cannot make it out just based on the clinical history. Around 13 weeks, she miscarried. Initially, she presented life-threatened miscarriage. She was managed conservatively, but later, after a week, she progressed to inevitable miscarriage and she aborted. What do you think is the likely diagnosis for this patient's 3rd miscarriage? And what investigations do you think should be done? Now, 1 miscarriage was in the 1st trimester, the other 2 in early 2nd trimester. Now, karyotyping on this patient was not done because there was only 1 1st trimester miscarriage. Antibodies profile was done, APLA was negative, and anti-thyroid antibodies also tested out to be negative. Her thyroid profile, HbA1c, everything was normal. All these investigations she already had. And she already got her TORCH panel assay also done. Now, I wanted to highlight this point. Please do not do TORCH test for recurrent pregnancy loss. TORCH infection can be a reason for sporadic miscarriage, but definitely it cannot be a reason for recurrent pregnancy loss. And especially if the TORCH test turns out to be positive, please look into it. If it's IgG, we really don't have to be bothered because it just tells us that that particular patient is immune. Only if it is IgM positive, we need to take an opinion from the infectious disease consultant. Otherwise, it carries no much significance. Now, on her transvaginal ultrasound, there was a unilateral endometrioma. It was quite small. It was around 2 into 2 centimeter, and there was a unilateral tubal swelling. I was not sure whether it was hematosalpinx or hydrosalpinx, but it was on the same side as that of an endometrioma. But despite having an endometrioma and a hematosalpinx, the women still had conceived naturally. She never had any kind of treatment. Even her 3rd pregnancy, where she presented to us, she had conceived naturally. Actually speaking, no reason was identified. We stood clueless. But as a last choice, because she's a woman with endometriosis, we thought a diagnostic histolab might add to some subsequent management, and we scoped her. Now, the moment I put in the hysteroscope, a very thick and a broad subseptum was identified. It was a partial septum. It extended from the fundus into the cavity. It did not get into the cervix. So we had to do a septal resection. Then we put her on estrogen therapy for 2 cycles. We asked her to try for a natural pregnancy. She tried conceiving naturally for 2 months, but she was really anxious. Then we had to do an IUI on her. First cycle failed, but second cycle she conceived. We gave her a cervical stitch at 15 weeks despite having a normal cervical length, because we operated on her uterus, and because she had a uterine abnormality, we had to give her a cervical stitch. At 35 weeks, she ruptured her membranes and we did an emergency section on her. She's doing good. The baby is also doing good. Now, the take-home point is that whenever there is a complete septum, it definitely needs correction. But whenever there is a partial septum, it needs correction only if the history is indicative. Because sometimes what happens is, even if the septum is partial, it could be a very broad and thick fibromuscular band, because septum is nothing but a fibrous tissue with some muscular component in it. It will be devoid of vascularity. And this is the main reason why some women, even with adequate uterine cavity, with the partial septum present with recurrent implantation failure or with recurrent miscarriages. And the point to be noted here is that subtle uterine cavity abnormalities cannot be picked up by a 2D ultrasound. We need to do a 3D ultrasound or a hysteroscopy to identify subtle uterine cavity abnormalities. Because what was seen in this patient on a 2D USG was that there was just a dip in the middle of the cavity. It never looked like a broad septum at all. There was just a discontinuation at the midpoint of the endometrial lining. Nothing else was identified. It was only with the hysteroscopy that we could make out. So yes, let's move on to the next case scenario. It's case number 5, Mrs. Sindhu, 25-year-old female, married since 2 years. She's a known PCO, obese girl with a prolactin value of around 24 nanogram per ml. Now, this is a very tricky value. Whenever serum prolactin is more than 25 nanogram per ml, you start putting her on cabergoline therapy. But now this 24 is a tricky value. I think it's the personal choice of the consultant to deal with such cases. I had put her on cabergoline, 0.5 milligram weekly twice for around 4 to 5 doses I gave her, because she's an obese PCO woman who's also an hypothyroid. So I think she definitely needed that to enhance her ovulatory status. Cabergoline definitely enhances the ovulatory status in the subsequent cycles. She's a known hypothyroid. She was on L-Proxin supplementation. Husband's semen parameters were normal. She had 2 consecutive miscarriages. One was at around 7th week. She had a blighted ovum. Second was at 8th week, where she had an incomplete miscarriage. Both times she conceived naturally, but she conceived following oral ovulation induction drug. Both cycles she was actually on progesterone support. Now, what do you think is the most likely cause for a miscarriage in this woman? She was actually on progesterone support. Do you think any kind of extra investigations need to be done on her? And do you think can we modify our management by any ways? The likely cause is very clear. She's an obese PCO woman on L-Proxin supplementation, and the cause over here is nothing other than endocrine dysfunction. But she was already on progesterone support. So the third time when she conceived, we gave her HCG injection along with the regular progesterone support. Now HCG here was given as a form of luteal phase support. Progesterone support was given in the form of vaginal micronized progesterone and dydrogesterone. Now, vaginal micronized progesterone is definitely preferred over oral progesterone, because oral drug undergoes extensive hepatic degradation and the bioavailability of the drug is very, very less. But once you give it vaginally, the only problem here is that you should convince the patient. But if you convince the patient and if you give it vaginally, then the endometrial level of progesterone is quite good. The biological activity and the bioavailability of the drug is too good. Systemic side effects are also very minimum. And dydrogesterone was given not just for the luteal phase support. We also wanted to add some form of immunomodulatory therapy because she had 2 previous consecutive miscarriages. It was for that reason that we added dydrogesterone. Now, luteal phase support was safely continued till 16 weeks. Usually, it is adequate to stop our luteal phase support by 12th week of gestation. But for this patient, because of her previous history, we extended it till 16th week. Theoretically speaking, the luteoplacental shift starts by the 7th week of gestation and it gets completed by 12th week of gestation. But there are certain subtle changes still happening till the 16th week of gestation. So not all your patients require luteal phase support till 16 weeks, but at least those with previous miscarriages, you can extend your luteal phase support till 16 weeks. And dydrogesterone was continued till 28 weeks, not for the purpose of luteal phase support, but for the immunomodulatory effect. And we delivered her normally at 38th week of gestation. Now, there are a lot of papers saying yes, there are a lot of papers saying no with the progesterone supplementation, but clinically speaking, 25% improved term life birth is augmented with the use of progesterone support. So definitely progesterone support has a role in these women with all kinds of endocrine dysfunction. And use of HCG as a standalone therapy for luteal phase support is absolutely not warranted. You cannot use HCG as a standalone drug. You can use it along with progesterone, because the mechanism of action for HCG is that it enhances the effect of progesterone. It enhances the progesterone production from the corpus luteum. It also enhances the decidual angiogenesis. So it favors early implantation of the embryo. It favors early embryogenesis. It favors the continuation of pregnancy. But this has to be given along with the regular progesterone supplementation. And as I told you previously, the luteoplacental shift starts by 7 weeks, completes by 12th week, but still certain subtle changes continue till 16th week of gestation. Now, the point to be noted here is that HCG cannot be a blanket therapy. It definitely raises the cost of your treatment. Each vial of HCG is around 350, 300, 350, 370 rupees. Weekly, twice you need to give it as a luteal phase support. The most important thing over here is the dosage of HCG for luteal phase support. It's only 2000 international unit for your luteal phase support. You cannot use the conventional 5000 or the 10,000 international unit HCG, because that's the ovulation trigger dosage. For luteal phase support is only 2000 international unit. By giving too much of HCG, you can actually do more harm than good. So you have to be really careful with the administration of HCG. And the other thing, this is absolutely an individual clinician's call. So I really prefer adding HCG, not just for my IVF patients, but also for my naturally conceived patients who present with endocrine dysfunction and miscarriages. And now, case number 6. This was the most challenging case out of all. 43-year-old Mrs. Jnanam, married since 18 years. She underwent IVF 4 times before. She had totally undergone 6 cycles of IUI. So it's 4 cycles of IVF and 6 cycles of IUI. She had 4 consecutive miscarriages and 1 IUD. So totally it is 5 pregnancy losses. Okay. First at 6th week, 10th week, 17th week, 20th week, it just keeps going on and on. And there was an IUD at 29th week of gestation. This was with us. Even 20th week pregnancy loss was with us in our unit. Now, this patient had egg donation for her IVF cycles. Embryos were absolutely good. She had a proper luteal phase support. Husband's sperms were good, though he was around a 48-year-old. He still had a sperm DNA fragmentation index less than 35%. Parental karyotyping was normal. We did a PGD on the embryos before transfer, and euploid embryos were transferred. It was an euploid embryo which underwent IUD at 29th week of gestation. The best part over here is that till 28 weeks, she was in admission. We kept evaluating her. We were extremely, extremely delighted and ecstatic because she crossed 28 weeks of gestation. Anyway, we plan to deliver her somewhere around 32 to 33 weeks. We were well aware that this particular patient is not going to go beyond till term. But we thought, okay, fine, we will deliver her somewhere around 32 to 33 weeks when she completes her 8th month. But what happened at 28 weeks, we did an obstetric Doppler on her. Growth was corresponding, the biometry was good, the Leica volume was good, placental grading, maturity, everything was fine. Obstetric Doppler was absolutely normal. But still, at 29th week, she presented with pain abdomen. There was brownish discharge, and then we identified it to be IUD. She actually undergone hysterolab twice before her embryo transfer. Now, this particular patient actually tested all antibodies to be negative. But she's a known diabetic and hypothyroid for the past few years, like 8 to 9 years. She was on regular medication and things were perfectly normal. HbA1c was somewhere around 5.9, 6.2 or something when she underwent her embryo transfer. And TSH value was also somewhere around 2 to 2.5. What do you think is the next ideal line of management for this particular patient? Do you think surrogacy has to be done, or should we do another embryo transfer, or should we meddle with her more? What do you think is the best line of management? Now, this particular patient has got 6 cycles of IUI, 5 cycles of IVF, 5 pregnancy losses, totally exhausted. More than the patient, we were exhausted. We were not ready to do anything else more on her, owing to her general health concerns. Now, what do you think are the left out investigations? We actually did all kind of investigations on her. The only panel of investigations which were left out were hereditary hemophilia testing. She tested to be positive, like protein C and protein S deficiency was there. Her factor V Leiden mutation was normal. Her serum homocysteine level was elevated. Okay, we did her hereditary hemophilia panel of tests. She tested positive for 3 out of 5 tests. But still the management will not differ for this patient, because whenever there is protein C or protein S deficiency, we give them enoxaparin, we need to give them low dose aspirin, which was already given. Whenever her serum homocysteine level is elevated, we need to give them adequate dosage of vitamin B12 and folic acid, which was also given before. So our treatment is not going to differ. It is only some reason we have identified for her RPL. Generally, hereditary hemophilia screening is not a regular part of our evaluation in the Indian population. For the Western population, we regularly do it because most of the Western people, especially UK people, they test positive for factor V Leiden mutation. But Indian population, very rarely we find such cases. So it's not a part of our regular evaluation. Even if they test positive, treatment will not differ. So we explained her, there's nothing could be done. We once again told her that in RPL, only 50% of cases are the cause for RPL, only in 50% of cases we can identify. Remaining 50% remains still unexplained. And whatever kind of therapy we give, it is effective only to 50 to 60%. The beyond 40 to 50% still goes beyond our hands. So that's why we explained her, we told her about surrogacy. Finally, after this hereditary hemophilia testing came out to be positive, she accepted for surrogacy, and we did surrogacy for that couple, and baby was also delivered a month back. So I just wanted to highlight this case because RPL is not always treated. There are still a lot of cases which remains unexplained, which we cannot manage. It goes beyond our management and it goes beyond our scope of understanding. So 100% RPL is not treated. But definitely RPL, if we evaluate properly, 50 to 60% of the times we identify a reason and we can treat them appropriately or accordingly. Now, these are all the important take-home points which I thought I will highlight in this presentation. Okay. Not all first trimester miscarriages is because of chromosomal abnormality. Okay, when you have a first trimester miscarriage, please do not put it to the chromosomal part. We'll keep it to the last. But if you identify some kind of chromosomal abnormality, the next best line of management for that particular issue would be PGD. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis on the embryos. So IVF will be the choice for the couple. And if you wish to identify a male factor for RPL, then sperm DNA fragmentation index is the only test which can talk to you about the sperm quality. And poor egg quality, which is indirectly suggested by low AMH, is also one of the reasons for RPL. Most of us really do not consider low AMH to be a cause for RPL, but classically, you know how these patients will present. They will present with recurrent chemical pregnancies. They might even present with recurrent episodes of ectopic pregnancy, recurrent blighted ovum. Then you really have to think about the quality of the egg. Actually speaking, even if the quality of the sperms are compromised to some extent, if the egg is really healthy, it can cause a self-repair in the embryo. But if the egg quality by itself is severely impaired, there is no remedy. It will definitely end up being a blighted ovum. So not all second trimester miscarriages is because of uterine anomalies. Whenever you find a second trimester miscarriage, please do not think about a uterine anomaly. You can have a miscarriage even in your first trimester. It does not always go as per the textbook protocol wise. And strongly consider high vaginal swab whenever the situation is indicative. Of late, we find a lot of cases with bacterial vaginosis and chronic candidiasis. Sometimes what happens, the women deliver so prematurely at around 26 to 27 weeks. When we send the placenta for placental swab for culture, it shows very high and heavy growth of candida, fungal infection. Those babies are very difficult to handle even in the early neonatal period, and neonatologist finds it really difficult because they crash and they pop off like that. So this infection is really worthy to be noted and to be taken care of. And it is not essential that all immunological cases of RPL will test positive for your antibody. In certain conditions, the antibody test might be negative, but still she will present with immunological infertility. So always do not wait for your antibody test to turn out to be positive, even if she is antibody negative. But if the history is suggestive of an immunological cause for RPL, please go ahead and manage it just like you manage an immunological patient. You do not always need a documented antibody test, because most of the times you may not get a positive antibody test. So the history is more suggestive and indicative. And let's look into these controversies. What is the role of IV lipid emulsion? IV lipid emulsion is nothing but what the surgeons commonly use it for their total parenteral nutrition. We also use the same. Now, this IV lipid emulsion is expected to bring down the severity of antibodies. So you can very safely use it on your immunological patients. We commonly use it for immunological infertility. This can be used for immunological cases of RPL as well. Definitely it will not bring down your antibodies level, but it will have an immunomodulatory effect, and it will definitely bring down your severity of antibodies. You need to give it once prior to conception, maybe around the ovulatory time. If they're planning for natural pregnancy, you can give it around their ovulatory time. If it's an IVF, we will give it exactly 2 weeks prior to her embryo transfer. Once her pregnancy is confirmed, the same day you need to give one more IV lipid emulsion, and then every 3 weeks till she completes 12 weeks, we need to continue IV lipid emulsion. It's a very safe drug, provided you just have to monitor her in the hospital. It's just like giving amino acid infusion, IV iron sucrose. Some people might develop anaphylaxis, so you have to be careful about that. This infusion should not run fast. And the next one is the role of GCSF for RPL. Now, GCSF is nothing but a granulocyte colony stimulating factor. It is a cytokine. Okay. We commonly use it for immunological cases of infertility, but now there are few trials supporting the use of this even in couples who conceive naturally. Similarly, just like you administer IV lipid emulsion, you need to give it around the peri-ovulatory phase and after confirmation of pregnancy every 3 weeks till she crosses 12th week. This is just a subcutaneous injection. It comes in a pre-filled syringe. Now, the last two modalities of treatment, I've just mentioned it to make you all aware that something like this exists. Okay. Lymphocyte immunization and IV immunoglobulin actually does more harm than good, because there are few cases which has been reported to have anaphylactic shock and death. To my knowledge, in Tamil Nadu, I think it's only in CMC Vellore that they commonly do IV immunoglobulin therapy. There also they don't do lymphocyte immunization, but they do IV immunoglobulin therapy, not for infertility or RPL. They do it commonly for severe autoimmune disorders with life-threatening complications. I did a short observership course for this RPL clinics. They're in Western population because they have a lot of antibody assays and positivities. Their IM immunoglobulin is not effective for the Western population. So there they regularly give 500 milligram of IV immunoglobulin infusion, but we have to be really careful because there could be significant side effects with IV immunoglobulin therapy. But it is still possible, provided it should be administered in tertiary care center. Now, these are all my list of references for the various kind of treatment strategies I put across in the previous slides. Actually, I have much more references, but these references I flashed it because if you have time, you can take a screenshot of this. You can get into this article and go through it. It gives you very valid clinical take-home points. It tells you exactly what needs to be done, what should not be done. That's what I summarized in my presentation. So thank you all so much for your patient listening. I actually have flashed an email, my email ID as well. If you have any more queries, or if you have any clarifications regarding the management part, you can mail me and I'll get back to you.